Hi, everyone, and welcome to this TECA Expedition. My name is Amola Mweno. I'm the CEO of BFA Global, and I'm based in Nairobi, and I'd like to welcome everybody from many places around the globe, I'm sure. The aim of this TECA Expedition Series is to build new perspectives on opportunities that lie at the intersection of blue economy needs and challenges, tech and financial. I think you may be aware that voluntary carbon offset markets are expanding fast. By some estimates, they should be worth $50 billion by 2030, which is not even that far in the future now. New marketplaces are being established, both centralized and decentralized. And we've seen fintech companies like Stripe that are integrating easy purchase of offsets into consumer purchases, which is definitely boosting demand and causing this whole market to grow. And blue carbon refers specifically to carbon stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. So as we're discussing in this expedition, could these new markets provide finance for adaptation that benefits vulnerable communities in the blue economy? And how could fintech solutions scale them up? We're going to hear in this session from Kenya's leading expert in blue carbon projects, such as Mikoko Pamoja, which claims to be the first blue carbon project dating way back to 2010, and also Vanga Blue Forest. Dr. James Cairo is the chief scientist at the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Institute and has pioneered a blue carbon program in Kenya, including its landmark projects that I just mentioned, Mikoko Pamoja and Vanga Blue Forest. And James, yes, I see you and look forward to hearing from you. And then we have representatives from two startups. We have Asad Khan, who's the director of remote sensing at Blue Forest, which is a UAE-based startup specializing in mangrove reforestation. And we look forward to hearing from you, Asad, on your program and how it's working. And also from Hans-Hedrick Hemming, who's the co-founder of a decentralized marketplace called Moonjelly, which has established a DAO. He'll talk to us about what a DAO is, to automate grant funding for blue conservation projects. And as we head into the panel part of the webinar, we're going to be asking, as we do with every expedition, what opportunities are there for early stage tech and fintech ventures in this particular area, blue carbon today? So we look forward to this session. I'm going to start out with a round of questions to the panelists. Then there'll be an opportunity to engage with questions that you have put in the chat and possibly that you will ask in person. And then we'll have the breakout session. So welcome to the panelists. And maybe I could start with James. And I think we'd all love to know, how did you get into this area? How did the Mikoko project work? How many people were affected? What's the value of the carbon offset that was generated? And anything else you think that we ought to know about the project, given that the audience here is interested but not super knowledgeable, and also given that we need to have time for other panelists. So maybe you could give us a brief introduction.
Thank you so much, Amolo. My name is James Cairo. It took a while to log in. I think sometimes you forget you did not save the number somewhere. And thanks, David, for resending. I'll be talking so briefly about how many minutes do I have? Because I don't have PowerPoint.
I think it would be great if you could just give a 5-minute introduction, and then yes. We can have an exchange of questions.
Okay. Now, as the facilitator has mentioned, I'll be talking about the Mikoko Pamoja, which now has upscaled to Vanga Blue Forest. This is a small venture project. It's a carbon offset project, which is using the mangrove, but using the principles of RED, which is the reduced emission from avoided deforestation. That's well known. But RED applies a lot on the terrestrial forests, When you come to Blue Carbon project, you are dealing with coastal wetlands. We define blue carbon as carbon stored by coastal wetlands, particularly mangrove, seagrasses, and coastal salt marshes. What we find is these systems, although they occupy a very small area of seabed, 0.5% of the seabed, they'll be contributing almost 50% of the carbon you find in the ocean. And that's substantial because when you look at their area overall, they're very small, but they're very good co-benefits apart from carbon capture. They are so critical for fisheries function, for shoreline protection, and that one is the backbone for the nature-based blue economy. So we are talking about a systems that is so rich. Yesterday, which was 26th of, the day before, which was 26th of July, every year, we celebrate the World Mangrove Day. That day would not have come without raised awareness of this critical ecosystem mangrove. And it's the mangrove degradation that moved us to developing the Mikoko Pamoja, which, as Amoro indicated, is the first community-type project to restore and protect mangrove through sales of carbon credit. So we are very proud of that. And our activities are very small, are very direct. Because this was a startup project, we were only conserving 117 hectares of mangrove in Gazi Bay. And you can Google Mikoko Pamoja. And in that 117 hectare, we are able to produce 3,000 tons of carbon that is now from the 3,000 from the 117 hectare. That's the amount of carbon we sell for the last 7 years, because our first sale was 2013 and our contract is 20 years. And after that, we were able to upscale to Vanga Blue Forest, which is selling double the 6,000 tons from double also the area of mangrove, which because the area is big. And the money they receive, which ranges from Mikoko Pamoja, we are getting $30,000, $25,000 to $30,000 per year. You may look at small money, but when that money comes to the community is able to support education, infrastructure, health, and also the bursary, together with the planting more mangrove. So we are looking at mangrove as a nature-based solution. And if Mikoko Pamoja type project can be promoted in other blue carbon area, we are able to conserve and protect the system. And before I finish, now what we are doing for Mikoko Pamoja, of course, we are scaling to other areas in our region, but we are also expanding to include seagrasses, which are really high carbon capture and storage, but they're more relatively complicated to work because they are always underwater. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe I could just ask a quick question and then we'll ask other panelists to describe their programs. What share of the income from the carbon offsets goes to the community, and how many community members are there?
That's a good question. When you are developing a carbon project, it's good to come with what we call the benefit sharing scheme. This one is included in the project design document. Our project serves 6,500 people now in 2 communities, one in Gazi, the other one in Makongeni. They said in the benefit sharing scheme, actually, because this was a startup project, we don't pay any tax to the government. The government does not cut anything. Maybe it will do in the future. So we only retain 6% of the income, which we shall use every 5 years for independent verification. But much of the money, that 2% go to community service, 24% go to paying the salaries for project coordinator, then there's 5% for office management. So it's all clustered. And the goodness with this information is really transparent. You can see it on online, if you Google Mikoko Pamoja and Plan Vivo, we are verified by Plan Vivo standard, which incorporates both. You have to have carbon benefit, biodiversity benefits, and community values.
Fantastic, thank you. Let me pass over now to Assad. I think you had an interesting journey into this this world of blue carbon. Could you give us a brief background and then also tell us about the project that you're currently developing?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Amolo. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel. So I kind of got into the blue carbon industry by accident. My background was in wildlife conservation, and I worked as a field guide in South Africa for a little bit. And then from there, I transitioned into being an anti-poaching special forces ranger. And then from there, I wanted the anti-poaching process to kind of be more efficient. So I did my master's in drone technology and wildlife conservation. And from there, I went on to develop drones with thermal sensors and artificial intelligence to kind of work with anti-poaching units. And then from there, the natural direction of things took me into studying satellite imagery. I went on to work towards developing predictive anti-poaching maps. And so I'm based in Dubai. I was supposed to go to South Africa to work with some companies there to develop these anti-poaching maps, but then COVID happened, so I was stuck in Dubai. And then I came across this opportunity at Blue Forest, and I didn't even know carbon credits existed. As soon as I heard about them, I was a bit skeptical, but the more I learned about them, the more interested I became in the subject. And I thought it was a really interesting way to fund conservation projects and have a huge impact on the livelihood and communities of people involved. And
so
the project. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to, yeah. No, I was going to, that's a very interesting route that I'm sure is unusual in the field. But I was going to ask you, yes, the Blue Forest project, if you could tell us about that.
So Blue Project is, we're a project developer, and we focus, our speciality, is a better way to put it, is mangroves. What we aim to do is develop mangrove restoration projects and conservation projects around the world, and set them up as blue carbon projects. Our flagship project, and currently our largest project, is in Mozambique at the moment, and it's roughly 185,000 hectares, and it covers Sofala and Zambezia. And it's a mixed project, so a majority of it is red, as James mentioned earlier, and some parts of it are reforestation and restoration. Now
Great, and so you are, oh, sorry, just so that I understand a little more clearly, you're the project implementer, like, are you the project owner, or you help people who have similar projects execute?
So we develop the project, so we get the permissions from the government, we scope out the areas, we do all the research, we develop the carbon model, and then we basically get people on the ground to work together.
And in this case, who are the people on the ground?
We're currently working with a few NGOs and a few companies that are helping us with our feasibility study and our stakeholder mapping. In Mozambique, we're currently working with FNDS. We're doing some work with a company called Verde Azul.
And you're a for-profit entity?
Yes, that is correct. But our financial model is, again, it's 80% of the money or funds we generate from the carbon credit stays within the community, and we keep 20%.
Okay, that's a very interesting model, and I'm sure people will have questions. Please use the chat to ask questions. I think we've already heard very interesting information, and if you do not have questions, I'll have more questions. But before I get there, maybe lastly, Henrik, do you want to tell us about Moonjelly, which is taking a very interesting approach?
I definitely will. Thank you for having me. What a great bunch of great people here, and I'm almost and already inspired by my two co-hosts on the panel. My name is Hans Henrik. I live and work out of Copenhagen here in Denmark, and I've always been a tech guy, you could say. I applied technology. I was one of the first in Denmark to do a web agency. I was one of the first to do a web consultancy around social media in 2003, 4, 5. And in 2011, I learned about Bitcoin, and especially the blockchain around Bitcoin. And I used a whole year in 2013, 14 to merge two smaller companies in that field here in Denmark. And there I learned about how companies, how we as individuals can utilize a blockchain. At the same time, I did a long swim. I circumvented an island here in Denmark. It was a 47K swim. And as I used to say, it was a long day at the office. And ever since, I changed whatever I have touched since then. So whatever I do is in the relation to the ocean. And I've started a swim club for ocean swimmers. I've done a federation. I'm politically engaged for swimmers and stuff. And I ended up in an NGO that politically worked on how to reduce plastic pollution in the ocean. And there I learned about how companies are valuing impact. And then I met a guy that knew a lot about the ocean as well, and had a vast network in that field. And we started out to create the idea behind Moonjelly, where we utilize a blockchain for doing good for the ocean. And the main idea is that we take impact that has already happened, and we wrap that into an NFT, a non-fungible token, and that we sell on a marketplace under market conditions. And the proceeds from those impact NFTs goes back to those who have created the impact. So we have tried to create an economical model for funneling money to those who, in fact, creates what the ocean needs, and that is impact. That could go in different forms and shapes. I'll come back to that later on. And we are not the ones who are defining what impact is. I can have a subjective opinion on what I think impact should be, and you out there, I'm pretty certain will have your ideas on what impact is. So as part of our umbrella, we have created an NGO in the US, where we have engaged 20 scientists who in working groups are defining solid, holistic, scientific principles that then we use for validating the impact out there. And we are open sourcing those principles in a way that everybody can use those principles as we do ourselves. And the validation takes place in our community, which is organized as a decentralized autonomous organization. So we have the NGO, the Moonjelly Academy, who are defining the principles as one entity. We have the community who are using those principles to validate the impact that has already happened. And then we have our impact NFTs out here that we sell on the different NFT marketplaces. That is the story behind Moonjelly.
Great. What's really the difference between the blue carbon credits that maybe the other two have discussed and the NFTs that you're creating?
Yeah, you know, NFTs as a broader umbrella, if you could say so, is not only about carbon. It could also be about biodiversity, or it could be about a beach cleanup when it comes to plastic pollution, for instance. Or it could be about data collection. Our first project is about data collection in relation to big whales. So we look at impact in a more holistic way. It's not only about having a hammer that looks for nails. And you know, when we focus on carbon, we see carbon all over the place. We look also on carbon, but we look also on different, other impact metrics.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll go back to James. James, your project started at a relatively smaller scale. I think you mentioned 117 hectares. And Asad, you're aiming at 185,000 hectares. James, in your experience, which is 12 years now, what have you seen as the barriers to scale? And then maybe I'll ask Asad to comment on the same barriers or other barriers that you're facing. But James, any comment on the difficulties of scaling up to a larger size?
Come again?
James, comment on the barriers or difficulties of scaling from the relatively smaller size that Mikoko Pamoja project of 117 hectares.
What has happened, and that's a wonderful question, Amoro, because at a small scale, it works very well, but also it means what is small. We already have scaled up to 500 hectare, and now we are moving to even greater hectare. It will be like 3,000, which we have not marketized. What is there is, there is these issues of people over expecting from carbon. And as much as carbon is a commodity, I want to be realistic because I come from a forestry and I'm a marine ecologist. And if you look at the value of blue carbon ecosystems, the value of blue carbon ecosystem in holistic way is far much higher than when we monetize carbon alone. So I wish we could monetize the fishery function. I wish we could monetize the shoreline protection function. But since there's no market ready now, it's not quantifiable, very viable, that's why we are using the carbon. But sometimes it can be abused, like what happened with the RED project, where people went and planted high water use trees, eucalyptus for carbon. And this is what is happening also in the, I'm seeing this happening a lot in the blue carbon ecosystem. People are planting mangrove where mangroves are not supposed to be. So that is not a blue carbon project. So my point of view is, how can we still gain? And that's why I like now the new concept of nature-based and nature-based solution, whereby we are using the blue carbon ecosystem to address climate Paris Agreement, the NDCs. If government realize can meet their commitment by conserving blue carbon ecosystem, not necessarily monetizing, whereby we can be able to see you leave your system healthy, that system will be able to meet your carbon commitment, Paris Agreement, post-2030 biodiversity framework, and other national commitment. That has been the challenge, both at local level. At local level, there is over-expectation of carbon. Carbon can do everything. Nobody see what the blue carbon is doing for their shoreline protection and the fishery function. At national level, there's that slow, the lack of funding. The government is there. It's very little money committed to the research and marine for that matter. So that becomes a bit complicated. And even moving forward, I think that building holistic of looking at ecosystems more for biodiversity value, climate value, and community, I think that becomes more sustainable.
Great. I think you've made some really good points about the need for a broader picture than just carbon. I think, Hans-Henrik, you probably have some comment on that, but maybe I could allow Asad to go first and comment on this question of scale. And also we have a couple of questions for you in the chat. Maybe I'll come back to those. Maybe you can answer the scale one first, and then we'll hold the other questions for the Q&A session, which will follow shortly. So go ahead, Asad.
Right. So going back to what James said about instead of looking at mangroves as just as somewhere to generate carbon, they have so many benefits to the community and to the coastline. That's the same views we have at Blue Forest. And that's kind of what our financial model is based on, the 80% that stays in the community, that goes towards developing sustainable fishery, developing education programs, finding alternative materials for people to build their houses out of. So that's where a lot of the money goes, and it stays within the community. And going back to your question about scale, so what we do is we rely heavily on technology. My background being remote sensing, we use a lot of satellite data, and we try to find the best satellite data, the highest resolution satellite data we can, and we identify hotspots in a mangrove forest. So our first step would be to identify a section of mangrove forest. Our second step would then be to see how much the mangrove forest has changed over, say, the past 10 or 15 years. Has it grown? Has it become smaller? If the size has become smaller, we go towards identifying the drivers. What are the main drivers? Is it people cutting down the trees for houses or for firewood? And then from there, after we discover the drivers, we develop a plan to address those drivers. And at the same time, we also, using satellite data, we kind of gauge what the carbon potential is of the area. We can also calculate, we calculate the carbon flux of the area. That's basically how much carbon cycling through that patch of mangrove forest. We can calculate the soil carbon. We can also determine things such as the plant health, the water quality, the air quality. So there's a lot that remote sensing and satellite data unlocks for us. And that's just what we use to determine which areas we want to work in or which areas need help. And then from there, we go and we kind of do field studies, do feasibility studies. We go and collect data on the ground and see how it matches up with our satellite data. And that's how we kind of develop our carbon projects and how we tackle the issue of scale.
Great. I'm sure that's inspiring to people in the audience. If you want to add any comments or questions for Asad. Hans-Henrik, any additional comment either on the subject of scale or on the multifaceted nature of the conservation of coastlines and mangroves?
Yeah, I'm very much inspired by what I hear here, and you know, we are numbers guys, if you could say so, in a very simple way of explaining what we do. We want to reward those who, in fact, not write applications for donations and money, but those who are creating the real impact. And when Assad is talking about, satellites and, remote censoring and so on, it's just sweet music in my ears because we need actual data, actual facts for being able to value the different initiatives out there. It's like being an investor saying, okay, do we want to invest in an unproven team, or do we want to put our money where we can see that they have shown results already? And we go for the latter part. So, utilizing the data and the facts from the different initiatives and projects out there is, from our perspective, the way to go. So I just wanted to emphasize that from our angle.
Fantastic. So I think we can move to Q&A. I see a lot of questions in the chat. I'll direct them to the panel. I think here's one. It was named as being for Blue Forest, but I think it's general for all three of you, which is how do you determine the distribution of the funds that are supposed to go to or do go to communities? Do you do this yourself directly, or do you outsource to local NGOs or other community groups? And how are those decisions made? Maybe I can just start with James. You could tell us how you kicked off this whole field in thinking about and determining this, and then I'll go around to both Assad and Hans-Henrik as well. James, do you want to respond to this question? James?
Hold on. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, yeah, come again.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you determine the distribution of funds that to the community? Do you determine this yourself? Do you work with NGOs or other community groups? Who decides what the money is used for?
Thank you, Amolo. I'm sorry, the network is, that's why I am I'm going always off on the web. What's happening, we do, and I indicated here before, during the project development, the PDD, and I can give you the link of the Mikoko Pamoja, we do have what we call a benefit sharing scheme, and it defines who gets, how the money will be distributed. But then there's that 2%. This at 2%, it comes, do you remember what I said? I'm a project developer. I don't handle the money per se. The money comes to the community. The community have a committee of 13 members, which becomes like the trustee of the fund, both the Mikoko Pamoja fund and the Vanga Blue Forest. And Vanga Blue Forest, we are talking about $50,000, which may look small, but it's really small. It makes up the model. Mikoko Pamoja won the Equator Prize because of his translation of biodiversity community and biodiversity community and environmental function. When the money comes, the community do a democratic, there's a prioritization. They have a bara, what you call a baraza. Baraza is a community meeting where they raise different priority needs of the community. Is it the water problem? Is it the education problem? Is it the fencing of the school? Is it the security? Then, based on the prioritization they have raised, the money is allocated.
Great, thank you. Assad, do you follow a similar model, or do you work through NGOs or other intermediaries? No,
we follow a similar model as what James said. We let the community decide where they think the money is best spent because they know best. Great.
Hans-Henrik?
Yeah, well, to be honest, we are very centralized as it is right now, but the way that a DAO works, a decentralized autonomous organization works, is that the participants who have governance rights, they can vote for where the money should go. And the money is collected in a way, when we create an NFT, it is all written in the code, you could say, right? So when when $1 is transacted, it is written in the code where that money goes until we decide otherwise. And that is a community decision. And the community decides based on who has the governance tokens. And by that, we start out very centralized, where we define the rules. And the more decentralized, the more members we will have in the community, the more democratic and the more decentralized the decision making will be. We're not there yet. We aim for doing so, and that is the difficulty in setting up a DAO. It is to set the boundaries the right way from the get-go, and we are about to do so. But to be totally honest, it's very centralized as it is right now, but we aim for a very decentralized model.
Great. I'm sure there'll be people will be interested in following how that evolves. Asad, we have a couple of questions for you. A question on the business model, who's purchasing the credits and from whom, with a comment that are the natural assets not the property of the local community?
All right, so I'm not really clued up on who we sell the credits to or who buys the credit from us. That's not something that's part of my role at Blue Forest. But going back to the question about the natural assets, we're not doing anything with the natural assets. We're not taking them from the community. What we're doing is we're actually enhancing them, and we're helping conserve those natural assets for the community or whoever is involved in the area. So we go and primarily we look at, for our reforestation areas of mangrove, we look at mangroves that have deteriorated at a rate that's higher than 1% of their total area per year. So that means within a few years, that patch of mangrove would not exist. So we basically go and set up conservation measures and reforestation measures, which involve the community. So the community helps us with planting. We heavily focus on women's employment, especially for the mangrove plantations. So yeah, we're not really taking anything from the community. We're actually helping enhance their natural resources.
James, you want to add anything to that? That comment on who's purchasing the credits and from whom?
Who purchases the credit? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Now,
and who sells them?
Our buy now, the carbon market, I always tell people, is a very easy concept to say, but it can be very complicated. It's really easy. And the more it is simplified, the more it will be complicated. So what has happened? We were able, I better say, what our building block, what has made Mikoko Pamoja succeed is because it's based on very good science, very high community participation, government support, and then international partnership. Our partnership have been able to create, we have been able to create a charity. We don't want to call them broker. It's not a broker really. We don't have a brokerage because that's why much of our money will come back to the community. We have a charity established in Scotland called Association of Coastal, we call it ACCESS, Association of Coastal Ecosystem Services. It's based in Scotland, and there's a reason for that. It's because Plan Vivo is also in Scotland. So it was easier to organize within, because remember, our project was built on the foundation of science with partnership with the University of Edinburgh and the University in Kenya Marine and Fisheries. So our buyers then come across. We have buyers from academia. We have buyers from travel company. As a scientist, wherever I go, the meeting I attend, like now I've been to the Association of Coastal and Marine meeting, I request them because this is, people have come all over the world, they purchase, they offset with us. So we have a wide range of buyers. And I can be honest, we don't even be able to meet the demand. So who sells? We sell through our charity. In the carbon market, we call it broker. but who buys is a variety. Even you, Amolo, you can buy and you will get a certificate labeled Mikoko Pamoja or Vanga Blue Forest. Thank you.
Great. You just told me you have too much demand, but I'll be happy to buy.
Yes,
maybe a follow-on question, a follow-on question from the chat, which is that a question is it true that measurement, reporting, and verification for blue carbon is more complicated or expensive than for terrestrial carbon? Are there additional barriers or opportunities?
Coming from the science, I know what's there is true, particularly if you're a starter. I've been luckily the Mikoko Pamoja is supported by the science who also developed the methodology. Particularly, I participated in the IPCC revision from 1926 to 20, what we call the 2013 supplement. So we are, and Plan Vivo doesn't have their own methodology, so it can borrow from DCS, the Voluntary Carbon Market, can borrow from IPCC. So to a starter, yes, it can be expensive and frustrating. But for as we move forward, and I always tell the starters, because of this complication, there are now other easier way coming, like we have the fair carbon, because we realize that so much people are spending a lot of money building the project and then they're frustrated. So we have now coming up together as scientists and other practitioners to come up with a fair carbon, whereby if you want, we know your area, we can be able to help you identify your carbon benefits from that. And also we do have a carbon primer. If you Google Blue Carbon Primer, I can give you this. Blue Carbon Primer is a book of collections of all experiences and challenges which people can hold on to. And we are more than happy to support processes, both for, but as long as we can show there's a high, we call it high quality carbon, which means it translates biodiversity, community, and the climate benefit. If we look at that, you'll think, you'll always find someone there, a group thinking, because when we cannot meet the demand, the problem is there are very few quality projects out there. And this is what we want to do, so that we want to bring blue carbon projects that are traceable, that are transparent, that are, really, that those words of to meet quality.
Great. Asad, I think your approach is also aimed at reducing the cost of some of the measurement, reporting, and verification. Do you want to add to that, along with a question from the chat, sorry, on how you determine the drivers with satellite data? Any comment on that?
Yeah, so yeah, the MRVs for blue carbon, specifically mangroves, is quite challenging. It is more challenging than, say, regular terrestrial forests, is because there's so many little aspects that you need to keep in mind, such as the salinity, the hydrology of the area, the species of mangrove. So you could have different mangrove trees in one area, and then you go, I don't know, a couple of kilometers upshore, and there are different species of mangrove which have totally different characteristics from the mangroves you've already looked at. So yeah, there's a lot of little moving parts you need to pay attention to while doing MRV in mangrove areas. And in terms of costs, using UAVs and satellite data helps a lot, because it helps speed up the process, and it kind of takes the guesswork and the labor intensive side of it. It reduces that by quite a lot. So that's what gives us the ability to monitor and work on much larger sections of the forest.
Great.
And,
Hendrik, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there was another question, right?
I think there was a question about how many years does it take to set up a conservation and or restoration of a blue carbon ecosystem, and I think this either you or James could address that.
So our project in Mozambique is for 30 years. So the setup is going to take about a year, and then after that it's all just verification and monitoring for the following years. So it's a constant thing that just goes on for 25 to 30 years.
James, anything you'd add to that? The time and effort to set up? I'm surprised Asad it's only a year, but let's see what James says.
Come again?
The time and effort needed to set up one of these projects, how long does it take?
In fact, initially, our first one took quite a lot. It took 2 years. But now the subsequent one are taking 1 or even less, depending on, like, it's like there's a push to do. And the great goodness with the Plan Vivo, it allows us to expand in a framework. We don't necessarily create a new project, but what they encourage us, we can expand the PDD within the same framework because we are working in the same area. So that one is speeding up. But if you have to be honest, if you are doing like the team in Mozambique, that can take even 3 years, 4 years, depending again on the rule, the national law, the community understanding the science behind. But as the interest increases, the time is coming down 1 year, 2 years, 1 year, 2 years. Financing, again, it depends. And that's why we are now thinking about the fair carbon, because to be honest, the project in Mozambique, I'm sure they'll spend $200,000 if they are being honest, because it's big area. If they have to consider all the meetings, all the hours, the first one we did, because it was based on science, we spent £50,000, which is almost $70,000. And you see, it's a very small project, but it was also, we included training of PhDs, a PhD student, and 2 MSc students. So in building up the capacity, which now helps us to expand, nowadays we are using $25,000.
Great. Hans-Hendrik, anything you'd add from you work on change that has already happened, or anything you would say about the setup?
I have a few perspectives when it comes to carbon and impact measurement and stuff, input and output. Yes, carbon projects takes time, and I agree with Asad saying, huge, very high impact projects, it takes a lot of time. That's one thing is to set up. Another thing is to capture and all that happens after the setup. And the third aspect is also who verifies the impact that has been created. And as it is right now, and that is one of the things that we try to conquer, if you could say so, or come up with a different solution to, is that the way that we today verify, for instance, carbon projects, it's very rigid, it's very expensive, and it takes a lot of time, right? We have those, specifically, institutions who flies all around the world on first class. It takes a lot of time. It's very expensive, and it doesn't do any good, to be honest. And what we are trying to do is to create a structure that from the bottom up can do the same thing. That is one perspective when it comes to what we are trying to achieve at Moonjelly. Another perspective is we want to decolonize the way we do this. It should not be white men from Europe who defines the principles. We think that the real impact and the people who are doing that real impact and can measure on it, that happens locally. We just need to empower them with the tooling to do exactly that. And that doesn't require those well-known conservative institutions. We need to redo that if you ask us for that. And the third perspective is when we measure on how we want to do good for the climate, is carbon, is that the answer? I will argue there are other answers to that question as well.
Okay, so, I think what I'd like to do is ask the panelists not to give us a report on what you discussed in your group, but anything that you discussed that caused you to reflect on something or think differently or more deeply about any of the points that either were raised in the panel or in your session. And maybe I'll go in reverse order and start with Hans-Henrik. Do you want to go first?
Yes, it's easy for me because I know what I think about what we are doing. It could be more interesting to listen to what the participants in the panels maybe, or in the different groups were thinking. But I think we came around the idea that yes, carbon credits is important, but we need to look when it comes to impact in a more broad sense, in a more diverse sense. That was one thing that we touched upon. A second thing that we touched upon was, and a very crucial one, in fact, is who defines the price or the value of the NFTs that we are trying to create. And that's a market, question. So it's about demand and supply, and it's difficult for us to say, okay, doing a beach cleanup of 10 metric tons, wrapping into an NFT, what should that cost? That was one of the good questions that I think we had around the table in my group as well. And maybe some of the group members can just maybe comment as well.
I think we're short on time, so let me let each of the groups comment. Asad, anything that you reflected on or thought differently about or were challenged deeper from your session?
Yeah, so one thing that came up was the education side of things, that there's not a lot of people that are experienced or know or that are really experienced in blue carbon and developing blue carbon projects. So what came up with the education thing was maybe there should be a way to educate people about blue carbon. But from my personal experience, what I've realized is it's not the education per se, it's kind of guiding people to apply what they know in the field of carbon or blue carbon. So for me, for example, I've never worked with mangroves or carbon or any of that before, but the transition was quite easy. It's just you just need to change the way you think about it.
Great, thanks. James, from your session, anything you thought about?
My session was really interesting. I had a participant from the region and also from Nigeria. And luckily is some of these areas I happen to have worked in. And there was scientific questions like the modeling. One question was, do we have the data space? And I was able to assure the participant that mangrove and the blue carbon projects like RED, you need a lot of data for what we call scenario modeling, what we call with and without project scenario, what will happen, because these are projects for 20 years, 30 years, depending on the standard. And then another interesting question was, everybody's doing mangrove planting. Can those be coupled and be converted to carbon credit? And I said, yes, the only thing, you need to have an MLV, monitoring, report and verify. So if you don't report, nobody will know what you're doing. If you don't verify, so that's where now the science comes. And I was able to assure my colleague from Kenya and my colleague from Nigeria that we do have approaches and even contact that we can be able to expand so that your activities become very viable and scalable.
This has been a fantastic expedition, and I thank the panelists and all of you participants for joining us.